Nobody heard the gunshot. That was the first strange thing. At exactly 7:42 p.m., during a dinner party loud enough to wake the dead, Arthur Bellamy, retired magician, amateur philosopher, and the most disliked man in the neighborhood, was murdered in his own living room. And no one noticed, which was impressive, considering there were 9 people in the house. The wine was flowing like a confession, and Arthur had spent the last 20 years making sure everyone in that room had a reason to hate him. I was invited because I was his neighbour. The others were invited because they were his enemies. Arthur liked symmetry. Arthur's living room looked like a museum curated by a man who hated museums. A velvet curtain hung over nothing. A top hat sat on a pedestal like it paid rent. A glass case held a deck of cards labelled in elegant script, "The Last Trick. Do not touch." Jazz pulsed from a stereo older than most grudges. It was the kind of music that sounded like it knew your secrets and disapproved of them. Arthur lifted his glass. "To all of you, my cherished disappointments." "To you too, Arthur. May your next life be shorter." Lydia Bellamy, Arthur's ex-wife, professional eye-roller, human lawsuit, smiled like she kept knives in her dimples. Arthur turned toward Martin. "Martin, still drinking things that taste like regret?" "Only when I'm around you." Martin wore a suit that couldn't decide whether it belonged in court or a bar fight. His hands trembled, but his smile didn't. Evelyn Price, critic and predator of fragile egos, swirled her wine. "This is charming, Arthur, like a funeral before the death." "Exactly. You always did appreciate my timing." Jonah Keane, Arthur's lawyer, checked his phone like it might rescue him. "Let's keep tonight civil, for the record." "You bill even when you're afraid. How inspiring." Clara Bellamy, Arthur's niece, hovered near the doorway like the house might bite. "Uncle Arthur, you didn't tell me it would be everyone." "Oh, Clara, don't worry. I invited you because you're the only one here who still thinks I'm a person." Theo Wren, my other neighbour, stood near the bookshelf, arms crossed, gaze fixed on Arthur like a laser searching for a reason. Theo was the kind of quiet people called suspicious when they ran out of adjectives. Then there was me. My name is Simon Hale. I tell you that because I'll be important later, and because Arthur would have hated being the only one properly introduced. Arthur clapped. "Everyone, one simple rule tonight." He pointed at the glass case. "Do not touch the cards." "What happens if we do? Do we vanish?" Lydia asked. "Worse. You'll bore me." A laugh followed. A few forced ones, a real one from me. I regretted it instantly. Arthur stepped toward the fireplace. The flames were low. Decorative. Everything about Arthur was decorative. "Tonight I will announce a little change to my will." The room cooled without the music changing. "A will!" Clara repeated the word as if the concept itself had edges. "Arthur, we discussed not doing it like this," Jonah interrupted. "I enjoy live audiences." "Oh, come on. You didn't drag us here for paperwork," Martin protested. Arthur smiled. "I dragged you here because I wanted to see your faces when you realize your stories about me weren't finished." He raised his glass. "To grudges. They age better than wine." At 7:41, the toast hung in the air like smoke. At 7:42, Arthur Bellamy stopped breathing, and no one noticed, because the jazz hit a trumpet solo that sounded like a man being chased, and Lydia laughed too loud at something Martin said, and Jonah's phone buzzed, and someone moved quietly behind us. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes of people pretending they weren't trapped in a house with Arthur Bellamy. Then Clara spoke softly, calling for him. Arthur didn't answer. She stepped closer with the hesitation of someone expecting a sudden ta-da. Her hand reached for his shoulder, her fingers touched fabric. Her face changed confusion first, not fear, like reality had made a typo. She said he was cold. Lydia rolled her eyes and dismissed it, as Arthur ignoring Clara, his love language. Clara's voice cracked and she corrected her. He was on the floor. Everyone turned. Arthur lay on his back on the Persian rug. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted, expression frozen in surprise like he'd just watched the universe reveal a trick he didn't understand. A neat hole bloomed in his chest. Not dramatic, not messy, just final. For one terrible second, the jazz kept playing. A trumpet wailed, a cymbal hissed. Then Evelyn walked to the stereo and shut it off. Silence poured into the room. And in that silence we heard something we hadn't noticed before. Not a gunshot, not a scream. A faint, almost polite click, like a switch being turned back into place. Lydia stared at the body, mouth opening on an inhale, and then she screamed, not the scream of love, but the scream of someone who just lost the privilege of saying the last cruel thing. Theo backed away so fast he hit the bookshelf. Martin's face drained and he said no 3 times like a prayer he didn't believe in. Jonah knelt with shaking fingers, cursed himself as he reached, checked anyway, and then looked up pale to say Arthur was dead. Evelyn blinked once and called it inconvenient. Lydia exploded at that word. Evelyn clarified, cool as ice, that blood was a nightmare for shoes. There wasn't much blood, that was wrong too. I looked around. 9 of us, 1 dead, no gun, no shattered window, no dramatic entrance, just a body and a room full of enemies. And the strangest detail of all remained. Nobody had heard the gunshot. Theo voiced the thought, tight with disbelief, about a suppressed gun. Martin started to ask who would have one before Lydia pointed out that Arthur would. Arthur, the magician, the man who owned 3 swords, and called them conversation pieces. Clara said we should call the police. Jonah was already doing it, telling everyone to stay where they were and not to touch anything. Arthur's voice echoed in my head. I enjoy live audiences. This wasn't a show, but it felt staged. The police arrived in 12 minutes, which felt both fast and impossibly slow. Detective Mara Sloane entered like she'd been expecting this her whole career. Short hair, sharp eyes, no patience for drama, making her a terrible match for Arthur Bellamy's house. She looked at the body, then the room, then all of us, and asked who found him. Clara raised a trembling hand. Sloane confirmed her name and relation. She pointed at Jonah and noted he had called it in. Jonah said he was the attorney. Sloane's eyes flicked to Lydia, and Lydia introduced herself as the ex-wife, unfortunately. Evelyn lifted her glass and introduced herself as the critic who reviewed Arthur's work brutally, honestly, artistically. Martin named himself as the former business partner. Theo muttered he was a neighbour. Then Sloane looked at me. I said I was Simon Hale, also a neighbour, and added that I shouldn't be there technically. Sloane observed that I was anyway. I explained that Arthur liked symmetry. Sloane paused like she wasn't sure whether to laugh or arrest me for poetry. A uniformed officer examined the doors and windows and reported everything locked. No sign of forced entry. Sloane crouched by Arthur without touching him, only observing. She called it a single shot, close range. Lydia scoffed at the picture that implied one of us walking up, shooting him, hiding the gun, and sitting back down like we were watching a movie. Sloane said yes. The room tightened. Sloane stood and ordered that no one leave. Evelyn smiled and remarked about not ruining the 3rd act. Sloane snapped that this wasn't a performance. Evelyn replied that everything was a performance, some people just better at reading scripts. Sloane ignored her and said the fact that nobody heard the gunshot mattered. Theo raised the music as an explanation. Sloane questioned whether it was loud enough to cover a gunshot. Martin offered too quickly that Arthur had props, and maybe it wasn't a gunshot. Sloane asked if he thought Arthur stabbed himself from beyond the grave. Martin clenched his jaw and said Arthur was insane. Sloane looked around again and said everyone in the room had motive. Lydia smirked and called it a party theme. Sloane's eyes flicked to the glass case labelled, "The Last Trick, Do Not Touch." She asked what it was. Clara said a deck of cards, Arthur's last trick. Sloane stepped closer and asked if anyone had touched it. Everyone said no too fast, including me, especially me. Sloane nodded slowly and said we would go one by one. Our relationship with Arthur, last conversation with him, where we were at 7:42. And suddenly, the room wasn't a living room anymore. It was a locked box, and Arthur had left us inside. Sloane started with Lydia, because Lydia was already acting like the main character. "Mrs. Bellamy," she corrected Sloane's insisting she wasn't Mrs. Sloane asked for motive. Lydia laughed and said he was her ex-husband. Motive was their wedding date. She lifted her wine and said Arthur stole her 20s, her patience, and her good opinion of magic. Sloane watched Lydia's hands and asked where she was at 7:42. Lydia pointed to the couch and said, "Right there," saying something mean to Martin. Martin glared that she had been saying something mean to everyone. Lydia called it a group project. Sloane asked if Lydia approached Arthur at any point. Lydia tilted her head and said that if she had, Sloane would know. Lydia didn't do quiet. That landed, because it was true. Then Sloane asked whether Arthur threatened her. Lydia's smile stayed, but her eyes didn't. She said he threatened everyone. It was his hobby. Sloane didn't push yet. She saved pressure for later. Martin sat down like his knees had finally stopped pretending. Sloane addressed him. Martin blurted that he didn't do it. Sloane told him she hadn't asked. Martin said Arthur ruined him. Sloane asked how. Martin said Arthur sabotaged their last show on purpose. Misdirection, causing Martin to fall off a platform. Break his wrist, break his reputation. He held up his right hand, shaking, and said he couldn't do fine work anymore. Evelyn told him he could still pour drinks and not to dramatize. Martin snapped that Evelyn's review finished him off. Evelyn sipped and said she wrote the truth. Sloane asked Martin where he was at 7:42. Martin pointed near the fireplace by the drinks. He said Arthur called him over, said he had something to show him. Sloane asked what. Martin hesitated with a kind of hesitation that smelled like secrets. He said a watch, some antique, important. Sloane glanced at Arthur's wrist and saw no watch. Martin flinched and insisted he didn't take it. Sloane said she didn't say he did. Martin said Arthur liked taking things from people and called it collecting reactions. Sloane nodded like she'd heard that phrase from too many dead men. Evelyn sat like she'd been invited to review the murder. Sloane asked her motive. Evelyn said art criticism wasn't murder. Lydia remarked, sometimes it should be. Evelyn smiled and said Arthur begged for her attention and hated that she gave it honestly. Sloane asked whether Evelyn and Arthur argued tonight. Evelyn said they flirted. Arthur called it arguing. Sloane narrowed her eyes and asked where Evelyn was at 7:42. Evelyn pointed to the stereo near the music, the trumpet solo suffering. Sloane suggested that put her closest to where the gun might have been hidden. Evelyn's smile sharpened. She said if she wanted Arthur dead, she'd do it publicly and want credit. She said it was a joke, and it wasn't. Jonah looked like a man who just realized the hourly rate didn't cover murder. Sloane said he was the lawyer and knew the will. Jonah nodded stiffly that he prepared it. Sloane said Arthur planned to change it tonight. Jonah tightened and agreed. Sloane asked who benefited from Arthur's death right now. Jonah hesitated and said, Clara, Lydia, several charities, and one person who asked to remain unnamed. The room snapped to attention. Lydia delighted in the mystery inside the mystery. Unnamed person? Clara echoed. Jonah said Arthur liked surprises. Sloane's voice turned colder and asked Jonah where he was at 7:42. Jonah said by the hallway. His phone buzzed and he stepped out for a second to check it. Sloane asked if it was a call. Jonah said yes. Sloane asked from who. Jonah swallowed and said, Arthur. Silence then. Lydia's sharp laugh about calls from the afterlife. Jonah went grey and said it came through. He didn't answer. Sloane told him to show her. Jonah held out his phone. Sloane stared at the screen, then at Arthur's body, then back at Jonah. She said it was interesting. Her tone changed, not panic, interest, like she just spotted the first real card in a rigged deck. Clara's hands trembled in her lap. Sloane observed she seemed least likely. Clara asked least likely to what? Sloane said, to kill him. Clara inhaled sharply and insisted he was her uncle. Lydia snorted that she had been his wife, and it didn't mean she liked him. Clara's voice hardened and said he was complicated, but he paid for her school. Sloane nodded and said, Arthur also threatened to cut her out of the will tonight. Clara froze. Everyone looked at Jonah. Jonah said nothing. Clara admitted Arthur said he might if she didn't stop seeing someone. Sloane asked who. Clara looked down and said, Theo. Theo's head snapped up, stunned. Lydia's eyebrows climbed. Clara flushed and said Arthur thought Theo was dangerous. Theo said Arthur thought everyone was dangerous. It made him feel important. Sloane asked Clara where she was at 7:42. Clara pointed to the doorway. She was watching him and didn't want him to announce anything. Sloane held her gaze. Clara looked like a rabbit trying not to blink, and rabbits were capable of terrifying things when cornered. Theo didn't sit. He hovered like he didn't trust chairs. Sloane asked why Arthur invited him. Theo said because Arthur liked watching him squirm, called him a quiet man with loud thoughts. Evelyn appreciated the line. Theo shot her a look. Sloane asked about any history of violence. Theo laughed humorlessly and said he built furniture. The most violent thing he'd done was assemble a bookshelf without swearing. Lydia remarked some people couldn't even do that. Sloane asked where Theo was at 7:42. Theo pointed to the bookshelf behind him. He was there watching. Sloane asked watching what? Theo hesitated, the same hesitation again. He said Arthur was talking and someone moved behind him. Clara inhaled. Someone? Theo said he didn't see who, just movement. Quiet. Sloane's eyes flicked around. Quiet movement in a loud room. A clue hidden in plain sight. Sloane finally turned to me. She repeated my name and asked why I was there. I said, Arthur and I had an understanding. She asked what kind. I explained that he insulted me and I survived. Sometimes he lent me tools, sometimes accused me of stealing his mail. Lydia smirked that Arthur accused the wind of stealing his mail. Sloane asked where I was at 7:42. I pointed to the armchair near the fireplace. Arthur was right in front of me. Sloane sharpened and said I had the best angle. I agreed and said I didn't see a gun. She studied my face and asked if I heard anything unusual. I thought about the silence after Evelyn shut off the stereo, that faint click, but I couldn't be sure, so I said the truth I had. I heard nothing. Sloane nodded, as if that was the loudest answer. Sloane ordered the house searched, every room, every drawer, every prop. Arthur's home was a nest of hidden compartments, trapdoors, fake bottoms, mirrors angled like lyres. An officer returned holding a small velvet pouch found in the study inside a hollow book. Sloane opened it. A tiny device. Metal. Compact. A suppressor. Lydia's face twisted. So there was a gun. Sloane said yes, and someone attached the suppressor, then removed it, then hid both. Martin said Arthur had these things for props. Evelyn observed that Arthur collected menace like antiques. Sloane looked toward the stereo, then the fireplace, then the glass case. She remarked that Arthur's rules were always part of his tricks and repeated the line about not touching the cards. Clara whispered that he said that twice. I frowned. He had, and I hadn't noticed. Clues hid best in repetition. Sloane stepped closer to the glass case and asked Jonah if it was mentioned in the will. Jonah said no. Sloane said then it was personal. She looked up at all of us and said one of us was closer to Arthur than we admitted. Silence. And then, because the house hated silence, a sound from upstairs, a soft thump, like something being moved, or someone. Sloane snapped toward the staircase and ordered everyone to stay. Theo asked if there was someone else in the house. Lydia's laugh came out wrong. She said Arthur would love that. Sloane climbed the stairs with 2 officers. We stayed below, trapped with our breathing. Evelyn leaned toward me and said if it was a prank she was suing his corpse. I didn't laugh because up there the house had made a sound, and the quietest sound in the room had always meant something was wrong. Sloane returned 5 minutes later with an expression not alarmed but annoyed. She held up a small brass object found on the landing, a tiny wind-up metronome. Clara asked why Arthur would have that. Lydia said to keep time while he ruined lives. Sloane clicked it on. Tick, tick, tick. The sound cut through us like a blade. She said someone wound it up recently. Theo didn't understand the point until Sloane explained the thump we heard wasn't a person. It was the metronome hitting the floor after it ran out of surface. Evelyn called it a little after-dinner percussion. Sloane turned it off and pocketed it. She said someone wanted attention, someone wanted us looking upstairs. Martin swallowed and said, misdirection. Sloane snapped that it was exactly that. The word hung there. Misdirection. Arthur's religion. Suddenly it felt like Arthur wasn't gone. He was conducting. Sloane made us recreate positions where we stood at 741 who we faced, who was within arm's reach. We shuffled like guilty chess pieces. The shape became clear. Arthur was shot from very close. The angle suggested someone shorter than him or someone crouched. Lydia immediately pointed at Clara. Clara shot back that Lydia was short too. Lydia smiled that she was also experienced at wanting him dead. Theo stepped between them instinctively and told them to stop. Sloane watched Theo do it, and her gaze sharpened like a hook. She noted Theo stepping between them without thinking, and asked if he was protective of Clara. Theo worked his jaw and said yes. Sloane nodded slowly, and Evelyn spoke in silk, saying the detective was circling the obvious. Sloane asked what was obvious. Evelyn offered Theo, the quiet one, the one everyone already suspected, the way these stories always went. Theo reddened and denied it. Evelyn smiled and said, of course he didn't. That was what made him perfect. And the room. Our brains did what brains always did in chaos. Grabbed the nearest shape that made sense. Theo. The suspicious one. The quiet loner. The one everyone expected. Even I found myself looking at him differently, which was exactly what the real killer would want. Sloane didn't arrest Theo, didn't accuse anyone. She asked something small. Who poured the drinks? Lydia blinked. Martin said, Arthur had someone. Clara whispered the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. Lydia waved it off as irrelevant. Sloane's eyes flicked to the kitchen doorway and asked if she was still there. No one answered right away because no one had been paying attention to her. That was the problem. Always. Sloane called her name. After a pause, a gentle voice answered from the hall. Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway with hands folded and posture gentle, like she'd been waiting for permission to exist. Soft slippers, polite smile. Somehow her presence made the room feel quieter. Sloane asked where she was at 7:42. Mrs. Finch said in the kitchen, preparing coffee because Mr. Bellamy liked coffee after dinner. Lydia scoffed. Sloane asked if she heard anything. Mrs. Finch said only the music. Mr. Bellamy liked it loud. Sloane watched her a second longer than necessary, thanked her, and Mrs. Finch vanished again as quietly as she'd arrived. The room exhaled. I realized that when she spoke, everyone stopped talking, not because she demanded it, but because the room forgot it was allowed to be loud. An officer returned with a discovery from the study. A false bottom drawer holding a sleek pistol case, empty, foam cut out, shaped like a small handgun. Sloane held it up and said, Arthur owned a gun. Lydia smirked that of course he did, probably named it. Martin tightened and said he did. Applause. We all looked at Martin. Sloane asked how he knew that. Martin's mouth opened and closed, then he said Arthur told him once and thought it was funny. Sloane didn't blink. She noted Martin didn't think it was relevant. Martin's hands trembled harder, and he said they were partners. Arthur told him everything. Evelyn murmured that Arthur told everything that made him feel powerful. Sloane leaned in and asked if Martin handled the gun. Martin shook his head too fast. Sloane softened into something dangerous and asked if he ever attached a suppressor to it. Martin swallowed and looked at the velvet pouch and admitted Arthur showed him how once, for a trick, a soundless shot illusion. Arthur told him the quietest sound in the room wasn't silence, it was attention changing direction. My skin prickled. The phrase was a signature, and Martin had just signed it for him. Lydia pounced, listing Martin's knowledge, motive, proximity, shaking hands. Martin told her to stop. Theo said it was too clean, too staged. Arthur wouldn't let Martin do something that simple. Evelyn told Theo to listen to the carpenter, that he thought in angles. Sloane stared at Martin, and for a moment even I thought we had him. He was the perfect suspect. History, proximity, knowledge, guilty look. Exactly why it couldn't be him. Arthur loved symmetry, and this was too symmetrical. Sloane ordered us separated. No more group conversations, no more shared alibis. I was placed alone in Arthur's library with a grandfather clock that sounded like it was counting down my sanity. Theo in the hallway, Lydia in the dining room, Martin in the study, Evelyn in the sitting room, Clara in the kitchen, Jonah in the entryway, Mrs. Finch somewhere. Officers moved between rooms like chess bishops. I sat in a leather chair that smelled like cigar smoke and old lies, and because Arthur couldn't resist, the house itself started to whisper. On the mantel was a framed photo. Arthur on stage, smiling, holding a top hat. On the back, in his handwriting, "The audience always looks where I point." I stared at it and noticed a tiny scratch on the floor by the fireplace in the photo, like furniture had been shifted repeatedly, like a hidden panel, like something moved often but never openly. My stomach tightened because earlier I'd seen the fireplace poker moved an inch. An inch was nothing unless it was exactly enough. I stood and stepped toward the library fireplace, decorative like everything else, but one stone at the base looked slightly newer. Sloane's voice echoed, "Don't touch anything." Arthur's voice echoed, "Do not touch the cards." I didn't touch the stone. I just looked, and in that looking I saw a faint smear like oil, like someone's fingers had been there recently. Quietly. Footsteps came behind me. I turned. Detective Sloane stood in the doorway, watching me like I was about to confess to the wallpaper. She asked if I found something. I smiled and lied about enjoying his taste in dead rich man furniture. Sloane stepped inside. Her eyes went to the fireplace, then to me, then back. She said Arthur had hidden compartments. I said he had hidden emotions too. Sloane didn't laugh. She told me to tell her what I was seeing. I exhaled and decided to be useful, pointing out the newer stone and the oil like it had been handled. Sloane crouched with a gloved hand hovering, watching before touching, then nodded and called it a good eye. She stood and said, I was the only one there who didn't want something from Arthur. I hesitated and admitted I wanted him to stop talking to me over the hedge. Sloane said that was still a motive. Fair. She turned to leave, then paused and asked again about 7:42 and my claim that I heard nothing. I said I did. Sloane nodded slowly and said sometimes nothing was the loudest thing in the room. Then she left me with that. Sloane gathered us again in the living room. Arthur's body was covered now, a white sheet like a surrender flag. The stereo sat silent. The air felt thinner. Sloane held up Jonah's phone and said, Arthur called Jonah at 7:42. Jonah repeated that he didn't answer. Sloane said, and yet the call happened. She ordered it traced. She said someone used Arthur's phone after he died, or used something that looked like it. Martin scoffed about a magic trick. Evelyn clapped once, slow, and said they were back on theme. Sloane cut through it. Arthur's phone was missing. The room reacted like a gunshot finally landed. Clara gasped. Lydia snapped her head around. Everyone started pointing at everyone. Martin pointed at Lydia. Theo pointed at Martin. Lydia pointed at Clara. Evelyn pointed at nothing because Evelyn believed she was above pointing. Jonah spoke quietly that Arthur kept his phone in his jacket pocket. Sloane nodded and said his jacket was still on him. An officer lifted the sheet edge and checked the pocket. Empty. Theo cracked, asking how someone reached into a dead man's pocket in a room full of people, and nobody saw. Sloane said yes. Evelyn smiled and called it a trick. Sloane's eyes flicked to the glass case again and repeated Arthur's warning about not touching the cards. Clara whispered again that he said it twice. Sloane said, and yet someone touched something. She stepped closer and examined the case without opening it, then stood straight and said the dust was disturbed. She pointed to a faint smear on the glass. Someone's fingerprints recently. Lydia asked if the killer opened the case. Sloane said no, it hadn't been opened. Theo asked then why touch it. Sloane said because it was bait and someone couldn't resist. It felt like a solve. The audience at home might have been purring. The cards, the fingerprints, the missing phone, the suppressor. Evelyn, too calm and wanting credit. Or Lydia, wanting him dead and loud but going quiet to prove a point. Or Martin, knowing the suppressor trick by the drinks. The brain loved this part. Sloane turned to Evelyn and said her name. Evelyn lifted her brows. Sloane listed the reasons. She shut off the stereo. She was near it. She was calm. She said she'd want credit. Evelyn smiled and reminded them, she said, art criticism wasn't murder. Sloane asked to see her hands. Evelyn extended them like a saint offering proof. Sloane examined. No residue, no blood, no tremor. Evelyn leaned in and told her to accuse with better evidence. Sloane's jaw tightened. Then she stepped back and said, fine. Lydia blinked, startled at the pivot. Sloane told her she said she was going to make them feel smart, not that she was going to be easy. Everyone stared because what detective said that? Sloane turned to Martin, held up the suppressor pouch, and noted he knew how to use it. Martin panicked that lots of people knew, and Arthur showed off. It was his favourite sin. Sloane stared, then suddenly smiled, clever and cold, and said, "Good." Martin froze. Sloane agreed Arthur showed off. She pointed at the mantel photo and said he loved attention and audience participation, which meant the murder was designed to be watched. My skin prickled as I asked, watched by who? Sloane's gaze drifted to the covered body and said, by Arthur. Evelyn whispered that posthumous narcissism was on brand. Sloane said the killer didn't just kill him, they performed for him, and the room felt colder because that meant motive wasn't just anger, it was intimacy. Sloane asked Jonah to read part of the will. Jonah hesitated, questioning the wisdom. Sloane told him to do it. Jonah opened his briefcase and pulled out papers like they were fragile. He began reading: the house to a trust, money to Clara, a donation to the local library. Theo blinked at the idea because Arthur hated books. I muttered that Arthur hated people enjoying things. Jonah continued, reaching a final clause, a condition. If Arthur died under suspicious circumstances in his home, an envelope labelled "the quietest sound in the room" was to be opened by the person who knew him best. Everyone spoke at once. Lydia claiming it, Martin claiming it, Evelyn dismissing Lydia, Clara unsure, Theo calling it a trap. Sloane agreed it was exactly that. She asked where the envelope was. Jonah said, in the safe in Arthur's study. Sloane ordered it brought. Jonah returned with a thick envelope marked in Arthur's elegant handwriting. The quietest sound in the room. Below it, open only if you deserve it. Lydia complained about Arthur's exhaustion from beyond the grave. Sloane held the envelope up and asked who knew him best. Evelyn said Arthur knew himself best and was unavailable. Sloane set it down unopened. Martin asked why not. Sloane said because everyone wanted what was inside, and desire made people lie. Theo muttered they'd been lying all night. Sloane agreed and said now they'd lie louder. Lydia asked if Sloane was baiting them. Sloane smiled and welcomed them to magic. She left the envelope in the centre of the room like a lit match and told us to wait. Sloane stepped out to take a call. 2 officers stayed nearby but not close enough to stop whispers. The moment she left, we became ourselves again. Lydia asked who did it. Martin laughed too high and said she did. Lydia said if she did, she'd have worn red. Evelyn tapped the envelope and remarked that Arthur wanted drama and they were serving it. Clara stared at the envelope like it was a snake and said they shouldn't touch it. Theo agreed. Jonah whispered that Arthur's safe was open and someone could have taken something else. Lydia narrowed her eyes at the mention, naming Arthur's phone. Jonah denied taking it. Evelyn noted Jonah was the only one who knew where the safe was. Jonah said Arthur told Lydia too. Lydia smiled that Arthur told her lots of things, mostly lies. Clara asked why Arthur would have an envelope about the quietest sound. Evelyn said Arthur believed silence revealed truth and said it in an interview. She quoted it, and he sent her a hate letter in return. Martin muttered that Arthur sent hate letters like holiday cards. I stared at the envelope, its precise showman handwriting, and noticed not the words but the way it sat slightly angled, placed carefully, rehearsed. My eyes moved to everyone's hands. Lydia's perfect nails, Evelyn's heavy rings, Martin's trembling fingers, Theo's calloused palms, Clara's bitten cuticles, Jonah's neat cuffs, and a memory surfaced. Soft slippers in the doorway. Quiet. Almost too quiet. I shoved it away because Mrs. Finch wasn't on my mental suspect board. Nobody put her there. That was the trick. A sudden crash from the kitchen, glass shattering. Clara screamed. Theo sprinted toward the sound. Lydia cursed and followed because she hated missing scenes. We rushed in. Clara stood by the counter, shaking. A mug lay in pieces on the floor, coffee spreading like ink. And on the counter was Arthur's phone. Face up, screen glowing, an incoming call from Arthur. Jonah went pale, recognizing the number. Theo stared at it like it was supernatural and asked if it was a joke. Evelyn said it wasn't funny enough. The phone kept ringing softly. A polite buzz, the quietest sound in the room. Sloane appeared in the doorway instantly, like she'd been waiting for this moment and told us not to touch it. Lydia pointed and shouted that it was calling itself. Sloane stared at the phone, then at all of us, and did the worst possible thing. She answered it, put it on speaker. Static hissed. Then Arthur's voice came through, not live but recorded, too smooth, too rehearsed. If you're hearing this, congratulations. Someone in this house wanted him gone, but he wanted something more entertaining. Lydia whispered that she hated him so much. The recording addressed the detective. She would suspect the loud ones first, suspect the quiet one next, and be wrong both times. Theo flinched. The recording addressed the guests. The quietest sound in the room wasn't the gunshot. It was the moment you realized you'd been watching the wrong person. Static. The recording ended. The line went dead. The room stayed silent. Even Lydia didn't have a comeback. Sloane stared at the phone and said, "Arthur planned this. Jonah insisted he couldn't have planned his own murder. Sloane said he could plan a stage." She looked at the broken mug and said someone placed the phone there just now. Clara denied it. Theo confirmed he was with her. Lydia demanded then, who? Sloane's gaze drifted past us to the hallway, to the quiet, to the empty space where a person could move without being noticed. She ordered everyone back to the living room. Back in the living room, Sloane set Arthur's phone beside the envelope, like two pieces of the same puzzle finally touching. She laid out the pattern. Someone retrieved the phone after he died, used it to call Jonah at 7:42, planted it in the kitchen just now to force a reaction. Evelyn called the killer a playwright. Sloane called it a controlled narrative designed to make us look at obvious suspects. The loud ones, the bitter ones, the quiet loner. Theo clenched. Sloane noted Arthur anticipated that suspicion, which meant he anticipated our mistakes. Martin swallowed and landed on the conclusion. It was someone else. Sloane agreed. Someone who benefited from being invisible. Lydia scoffed that they were all in the same room. Sloane said some people took up space, some people disappeared in it. Then Sloane asked something mundane and wrong. Who turned the music up? Silence. She repeated, who adjusted the stereo before Evelyn turned it off? Martin thought Arthur did. Clara didn't see him. Theo said the volume changed. Someone did it. My stomach tightened because I remembered. The music surged slightly right before we noticed Arthur's body. A small change. A quiet change. The kind you noticed only if you were paying attention to nothing. Sloane's eyes landed on me and returned to my claim of hearing nothing at 7:42. Then she said, someone heard something else. A faint click after the music stopped. Lydia demanded who heard it. Sloane didn't answer. She looked at the floor near the stereo, then at velvet slippers by the hall runner, then at the doorway. She called softly for Mrs. Finch. No answer. She called again, sharper. After a pause, Mrs. Finch's gentle voice answered from the kitchen. She stepped into the doorway with folded hands and calm expression. And something clicked in me. Not a gun mechanism. Attention. She always appeared, right after something happened, like a stagehand after a scene change. Sloane asked where she was just now. Mrs. Finch smiled and said, "Tidying." Sloane nodded like she expected that. Lydia waved her off and demanded they stop interrogating staff and focus on the psychos. Mrs. Finch didn't react, just present, quiet, too quiet. Sloane watched her without accusing, not yet, not until the last possible moment, because if she did too early, we'd stop watching. And the story demanded we keep watching. Sloane picked up the envelope, and the room leaned forward. She said Arthur wrote it for the person who knew him best, and Jonah called that subjective. Sloane agreed and said they would let Arthur decide. She described Arthur's love of tests and forcing people to reveal themselves, and said she would ask each of us one question. The same question. She asked Lydia what sound Arthur hated most. Lydia, caught off guard, said children laughing. Clara started to protest, and Lydia snapped that he hated joy and not to correct her. Sloane asked Martin what sound Arthur hated most. Martin said a wrong note. Arthur would stop rehearsals if the piano... Sloane moved on. Sloane asked Evelyn what sound Arthur hated most. Evelyn said, "Applause that isn't earned." Sloane asked Jonah. Jonah said a pen scratching when someone signs without reading. Sloane asked Clara. Clara whispered silence. Everyone looked at her. Clara's eyes filled as she explained he hated silence because it meant people were thinking. Sloane asked Theo. Theo said footsteps he didn't control. Sloane's eyes flicked, tiny, toward the hall. Sloane asked me. I swallowed and said a ticking clock because Arthur complained about it through the open window more times than anyone should endure, saying it reminded him he couldn't misdirect time. Sloane nodded slowly, then turned finally to the doorway, to the soft shoes, to the quiet presence. She asked Mrs. Finch what sound Arthur hated most. Mrs. Finch paused, tiny, delicate, and that pause rang louder than any gunshot. Then she answered softly, "A vacuum." Lydia barked a laugh. Mrs. Finch said Arthur called it an insult to quiet work. Sloane stared at her, then at the envelope, then back, her expression saying we were at the edge of the reveal, but not yet. Not until every last thread tightened. Sloane set the envelope down and walked to the glass case labelled, "The Last Trick. Do not touch." She pointed to the floor beneath it, a mark like it was moved a few inches recently. Theo asked if the case moved. Sloane said yes. Martin's eyes widened at the implication of a hidden compartment underneath. Sloane noted he was learning. Evelyn suggested he was remembering. Sloane knelt and examined the baseboard, then looked up and asked who would know the house best. Lydia claimed it. Jonah said Arthur changed the locks after the divorce. Clara whispered, "Arthur changed everything." Sloane said so, who would still know where everything was. Martin started to speak and stopped, because it wasn't him or Lydia or Jonah or any of us invited for the show. It was someone who lived in the background of it. Still, Sloane didn't say it. Not yet. Instead, she turned off the lights. The room erupted, Lydia shouting, Clara panicking, Martin confused, Evelyn pleased at the ambience. In the darkness, Sloane ordered nobody move. To listen. The house settled into breathing, cloth shifting, a distant refrigerator hum, then a soft sound near the hallway, a tiny, careful step, the quietest sound in the room. Sloane snapped a flashlight on. The beam caught someone near the doorway, someone who shouldn't have been, moving. A figure in soft shoes. The beam lifted, and then Sloane turned the lights back on. Everyone blinked, disoriented. The figure was back in place, hands folded, polite smile, as if they'd never moved. as if the house itself imagined it. Sloane said now they were listening. Sloane walked to the coffee table and picked up the envelope. Her eyes met mine for half a second, then she looked at the room. She said, "Arthur's recording predicted our suspicion. Loud ones first, then the quiet loner. And we did." Theo flinched. Sloane said the killer wasn't loud, and it wasn't the obvious quiet one. It was the person everyone's brains deleted. She turned, and for the first time everyone followed her eyes to the doorway, to the gentle smile, to the soft slippers, to the woman we'd been talking around all night like she was furniture. "Mrs. Finch." Lydia said no. Clara whispered her name like it was suddenly unfamiliar. Martin blinked fast, stuck on the idea that she was just Mrs. Finch supplied the word, the housekeeper. Her voice stayed gentle and calm, but now it sounded like a blade wrapped in velvet. Sloane said she adjusted the stereo, moved like a ghost, could reach Arthur without anyone noticing, because no one looked at her. Mrs. Finch said people looked at what they were told to look at. Evelyn's eyes widened, delighted and horrified at once, calling it exquisite. Lydia stepped back and asked why. Sloane answered. Arthur fired her and replaced her with a robot vacuum. Mrs. Finch's smile didn't change, but her eyes finally did. She said he said it was quieter. Theo, stunned, asked if that was it. Mrs. Finch asked if he knew what it was like to be the quietest thing in every room, ignored so completely that your footsteps didn't count as sound. She stepped forward in slippers that made almost no noise. She said Arthur noticed her only to insult her. Sloane held up the suppressor pouch and said she knew his props because she cleaned around them every day. Mrs. Finch said she dusted his secrets and polished his lies. Sloane lifted Arthur's phone and said she took it from his pocket, called Jonah at 7:42 to create confusion, and planted it in the kitchen. Mrs. Finch's smile sharpened just a fraction, and she said, Arthur loved timing. Sloane narrowed and asked about the envelope. Mrs. Finch's gaze flicked to it, just a flick. Enough. Sloane nodded and said she placed it and couldn't resist being part of his last trick. Mrs. Finch sighed, not regret, but relief, and said Arthur told her once the greatest trick was making people look the wrong way. Lydia choked that they didn't look at her at all. Mrs. Finch said, exactly. Sloane tore open the envelope. Inside was a single card. Arthur's handwriting declared, "She will do it, and none of you will see her." Clara gasped. Theo swore under his breath. Evelyn laughed once, short and stunned, and called it prophecy. Sloane asked if Arthur knew she'd kill him. Mrs. Finch nodded and said he wanted it, not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted to be right. Sloane said then she gave him what he wanted. Mrs. Finch stepped closer to the covered body and looked down at the sheet like it was laundry. She said she gave him the quietest sound in the room. Sloane nodded to the officers. They moved in. Mrs. Finch didn't run or scream. She held out her hands as if being seen finally was enough. As they cuffed her, Lydia whispered how none of them saw it coming. Sloane said because Arthur trained them. Clara echoed the word. Sloane held up the card and said, Arthur's last trick wasn't the murder, it was the audience. He invited people who would draw attention, loud personalities, big grudges, and made sure they stared at each other. Evelyn murmured that he staged his own misdirection. Sloane agreed and said the person who could move silently, who could operate the house like a stage, did what he predicted. Theo asked if Arthur orchestrated his own death. Sloane said he didn't pull the trigger, but he set the table. Jonah called it sick. Sloane looked at Arthur's covered face and said, it was Arthur. Mrs. Finch looked back once as she was led away and said, Arthur always claimed silence made people honest. She paused at the threshold and added with the faintest smile that it also made them blind. The house fell quiet again. No jazz, no arguing, no Arthur, just the sound of the police radio crackling, distant and impersonal. Sloane looked at me as she left and asked if I ever heard the gunshot. I swallowed and said no. Sloane nodded and said, "Good." Then Arthur's last trick worked. She stepped out into the night. And behind her, in the empty living room, the grandfather clock finally spoke, tick, 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 like time applauding itself. And I realized the chilling truth. The quietest sound in the room is the moment everyone realizes they were the misdirection. Kindly subscribe, like and share for more exciting stories.